Jo. Sehr gut. Die erste, was wird reden, wird sein, Dr. Valentina.
Ja. Nu, das ist deine Freund, deine Chaverim, deine Kollegen, deine Lehrer. Nu, wenn man hat man da nicht alle man hat man.
Chachomim, Gionim.
Oder so Gaonim, ja. Das ist bei uns Mamesh ein größeres Schuss mit Kabelponim zu sein, euch alle men, die Teilnehmer und die Zuhörer auf unserer Konferenz. Das heißt, seid begrüßt. Wir gedenkt alle und wir haben sich gedacht, schon in der Mond, in Nonne, haben wir gewollt, euch zu neu bleiben in Paris. Und wir haben gewollt, dass wir sollen sich bekennen und dass wir sollen reden, Ponim al Ponim, und dass wir sollen herumreden, Fragen, was interessieren uns. Aber mach nicht das. Ein Mensch tracht und Gott lacht, wie man weiß. Und
Tomit lacht.
Tomit lacht, ja. Gamso le Teuwe. In Ordnung. Und wir bedanken euch sehr, als nicht geguckt auf verschiedene Menüs, auf verschiedene Zeitzonen in Frankreich, Amerika, Israel, Russland, nicht geguckt auf eure blischumsäufig übergeladene Programme von Onepjor, nicht geguckt auf der Zebusche Magefe und auf alles Ding, sehen wir sich Tage heint in Zoom. Das ist ein größer Glück in der Nemsen für uns allen. Wir haben sich gestartet, dass die Programm von der Konferenz soll euch kommen a vielfarbige, als sie soll reinnehmen klassische Sujetten von der jiddischen Übersetzungstradition und euch dem modernen schäferischen Uftu von der jiddischen Kultur. Unsere Arbeitssprachen seien Jiddisch und Englisch. Das heißt, also ihr könnt reden, kommentieren, stellen Fragen, witzeln sich, alles was ihr wollt, in Jiddisch oder in Englisch. Aber seid ihr so gut, setzt sich nicht allein über. Das ist nur eine Sprache, weil alle verstehen sich Englisch und Jiddisch. Seid ihr so gut, euch fühlt sich frei, bemächtigt die Diskussionen aufzuheben, die Hand und zu stellen eine Frage. Das ist, lassen wir oben brennende Diskussionen. Ich wünsche euch allen eine interessante Konferenz und ich gebe das Wort meinen Kollegen für eine kurze Hakdome.
Größten Dank, Valje. Ich bin euch sehr, sehr zufrieden, euch zu begrüßen, euch zu sehen. Ich will, also wie wir wollen reden etliche Sprachen, will ich rüber auf Englisch, also man soll hören, euch hineinführen ein bisschen Englisch. I'm really very happy that this conference takes place, even if it was a long way and we had to go through several difficulties. I really thank everyone for the availability for the patients, and this conference is the fruit of a collaboration between Maison de la Culture Yiddish, Pariser Yiddish Center, Maison de la Culture Yiddish, and INALCO, the French Institute for Oriental Languages and Cultures, where I work and where Valentina has worked in the past years as well. This is also part of a broader project which is financed by the French National Research Agency, ANR, Agence Nationale de la Recherche, and this project aims at studying, comparing the various translations from Jewish languages, not only Yiddish. Yiddish is an important part, of course, but also Judaism and a little Judeo-Arabic into other languages, and also the reverse from European languages into Jewish languages. The idea is to understand the common points between those various Jewish languages in their relationship to translation and the difficulties they meet. We have already had a small conference on editing and translating Judeo-Spanish texts, And now we are very happy to have this bigger conference on the translation of Yiddish and the relationship between Yiddish and translation. So I'm very happy once more, and I will give a word to my colleague Tal.
Großen Dank dir, Arno. Ich will euch begrüßen, euch und die Anteilnehmer in Konferenz, direkt die Mitorganisatoren von Konferenz im Namen von Pariser Yiddish Center mit dem Bibliothek. Das heißt, als Arno Bikar und Vali Fetchenko sind die Hauptorganisatoren von der Dosiker Konferenz, von Inelko, wie gesagt, und Sharon Bar-Kochba und ich sind die nicht so silent Partners, aber sofort Partners, nicht die Hauptorganisatoren, ist, wenn Arno und Vali haben vorgelegt, wir sollen organisieren eine Konferenz, Jiddisch in Übersetzung, hat der Pariser Yiddish Center Avade angenommen mit beide Hände als eine Initiative, und ich bin sehr, sehr zufrieden zu sehen, als noch so viel Zeit und nachdem, was man hat abgelegt zu lieb der Pandemie, hat man soft bewiesen, ja, durchzuführen unser Plan. So it is a real pleasure to have all of you here, and it's great that the Paris Yiddish Center also takes part in academic conferences as it did in the past, and hopefully will continue to do in the future. Ja, ich bleibe mit Yiddish. Dachte ich, als alle verstehen, wie sei wie, aber gut. Eider, wir gehen rüber zu unserer Keynote, will ich früher euch bekennen mit unser logistischen Koordinator. I'll switch to English. Before we move to the keynote, I'd like to introduce to you our logistics coordinator, Brian. Where is
Hello.
Brian now?
Hi.
Hi. So Brian, thank you so much, Brian, for helping with all the logistics for this conference. And Brian would also like to say a few technical stuff before we start for real. So Brian.
Great. Thank you, Tal. Hi, just a few quick remarks concerning logistics for the conference. We'd like to remind you to please stay muted during the sessions. If you use the hand raising function at any point, please remember to lower it after you speak. The website, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, should be used as a resource throughout the conference. You'll find the full program there as well as the Zoom link. If you have any logistics questions at any point or concerns, please direct them towards the conference email address, the one you've been contacted from. We'd like to keep the chat here and the Zoom reserved for conversations concerning the conference. Okay, and that's all.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian. I hope that my internet connection is okay. Was Brian a bit disconnected for everybody, or just for me? For everybody. Okay, so my connection is probably good. So, friends, I am both honored and glad to present to you today's keynote speaker, Saul Noam Zaritt. We had this conversation. Saul Noam Zaritt is an associate professor of Yiddish literature at the departments of comparative literature and Near Eastern languages and civilizations at Harvard University. He's an accomplished academic and a dedicated Yiddishist, and his work concentrates on modern Jewish writing and the politics of translation, examining how writers move between cultures and across boundaries to reimagine the languages of Jewish experience. His scholarship brings together Yiddish studies, contemporary theories of world literature, and digital humanities. His most recent book, Jewish American Writing and World Literature, Maybe to Millions, Maybe to Nobody, was published last year in Oxford University Press. His scholarly work, which also engages with Hebrew literature and Jewish American literature, among other things, has appeared in prestigious journals such as Proof Texts, Studies in American Jewish Literature, and American Literary History. Zaritt is a founding editor of Ingeweb, an excellent open access digital journal of Yiddish studies, which we all, probably all of us, use and love daily. The title of Saul Noam Zaritt's talk today is A Taytsh Manifesto, and I invite you, Noam, to give your lecture.
Shalom Dank euch allen. Thanks everybody for coming here and but not in Paris as we'd want to be. But this is exciting in any case to see everybody's faces. And thank you for that introduction. I sent him a very short one and he made it longer. So let's see, here we go. Okay, so I want to start our conference by thinking about 3 moments of translation, and to construct out of them something I'm calling my Touch Manifesto. Now, the 3 examples I'm going to think about here are somewhat arbitrary, and perhaps they don't cohere in any definitive way, but I think that's something of the point exactly. And I've sensed from perusing some of the titles of our talks that these aren't exactly the texts we think about when we think about Yiddish and translation. So one of the things I want to emphasize today is that when we talk about Yiddish and translation, I don't want us to begin from the assumption of some kind of discrete transfer between 2 separate languages, as if we could measure precisely the exchange between one entity we might name as Jewish and another entity named as non-Jewish. Instead, I want us to begin from the proposition that we're always already speaking in and through translation, that we are already speaking in multiple languages at once, that all translation, like all language itself, is messy. And one of the things I'm proposing is that Yiddish, as a language and cultural paradigm, wears this translationality on its sleeve in some way. So in order to make this kind of argument, what I'll do today is outline a reading paradigm, one that advocates for Yiddish studies that foregrounds translation, or a somewhat aligned term, a little bit different, but somewhat aligned, Taytsh, that foregrounds Taytsh as the central engine of Yiddish and maybe even all of modern Jewish culture. So rather than seek out objects or subjects one could identify and describe as quote unquote Jewish in one way or another, what I hope to demonstrate today is that a more productive reading strategy is one that lingers in the uncertainty of translation in order to encounter without apology or without normative prescription, the multi-directionality of Jewish modernity. Now, I know that's a bit abstract, so let's jump instead right into the text, and we'll come back to the manifesto later. There are 10 points to the manifesto, so don't worry, the more bombastic stuff is coming later. Okay, so let's start with a well-known and the most well-known and oldest example of one of the famed or infamous origins of literary Yiddish, the 14th century epic Dukus Harant. I'm sure in the audience there are those that know this text and could talk about it much better than I could, but I'm only going to offer a brief sketch of the language politics of this epic bridal quest. The text is composed in what today we would know as Middle High German and written in Hebrew characters. The question that many scholars ask is what makes the language here Jewish, beyond, say, the Hebrew script or some sense of what the imagined or intended audience and cultural context might be. So is there something in the body of the text, in the language of the text, that renders it distinctly Jewish? They often ask, right, is this a German transcription in Hebrew characters or a Yiddish translation, adaptation, or something else entirely? Now, for those who believe that they might be able to find some kind of linguistic home or some kind of national identity for this text will inevitably be disappointed, for Dukus Harant is Jewish and non-Jewish, or as some put it, German with Jewish coloring. The anxiety around this text, its non-identity among scholars, reaches its boiling point around a single word, tifle. In the manuscript, in a moment in which one would expect a German word for church, the queen in the tale is going to church on Pentecost. One finds instead the Hebrew word tifle. Tifle has a variety of meanings, mostly tastelessness or triviality, bordering on indecency. Tifle is also dangerously close to the Hebrew word tefillah. You just need to shift a yud around, of course. The proximity between the negative and positive significations makes this wordplay all the more biting, as the faithful transcription of a house of prayer gives way to the anti-Christian house of folly. Right? Now, this kind of substitution later became very popular among Jewish writers in many languages, where an obviously Christian term is replaced by a negative equivalent in Hebrew, which on the one hand destabilizes this institutionalized non-Jewish language, at the same time also desacralizes Hebrew, moving it away from a language of liturgy to a language of comedy, which is, many people have written a lot about it, it's very exciting. But one might think of it for our context for this conference, right? One might think of this as a failed translation, even if the failure is premeditated in some way, right? So in the transfer of the text from a non-Jewish audience to a Jewish one, the author or scribe of Dukuzharant finds this one word unacceptable with its overt Christian significations. And so in this moment, Jewish difference is marked and countersigned. Yet at the same time, this moment of difference doesn't erase the entire act of cultural exchange that surrounds the text. It calls attention precisely to its instability, right? The text cannot, in this moment, the single word doesn't render the whole text suddenly absolutely and fundamentally Jewish. Instead, what we're reminded here of is how the text constantly performs its mobility across communities. The Jewishness of the text emerges in a moment of failed or charged translation, a moment in which the text finally or suddenly arrives elsewhere. So even so, we can hardly name this text or the language of this text Jewish in any definitive way. What I'm going to say is that we should call it Taytsh. Okay, more on this soon. Now to text number 2. Let's jump forward some 500 to 600 years to another epic story that unless you've heard me talk before, perhaps none of you have heard of this text ever. It's the famed and infamous novel, Die blutige Frau, The Bloody Woman, also something of a twisting bridal quest, also seemingly anonymously authored. It's one of the serialized novels that shocked and delighted Warsaw readers in 1910 and helped turn the newspaper Hyphen into the sort of mega newspaper that it was, into the popular and populist publication that it became in Warsaw. And I won't go too far into the plot details. I don't want to ruin anything for everybody. But I will tell you a little bit about the novel. The aforementioned Bloody Woman, she conspires with her lover to kill her husband. Along the way, 2 workers are framed for the murder. There are lost brothers and lovers and daughters along the way. We also meet a charming Warsaw thief, including his very idiosyncratic idiolect, his thieves, Ganovim Loshen that he has. There are dramatic suicides, long train rides to prisons in Siberia, and so on. I won't go too far into it. And though I said that the novel was published anonymously, it was later Avram Leib Yakubovich, who became a Hebrew writer and moved to Palestine, then Israel. He ended up confessing in a letter at some point to having written many of the Schön Romanen, the pulp novels that appeared in Hyphen. And we get from this amazingly rare confession something of how a Schön Roman was written. So I'll give you a little bit of an account of that. What would happen, amazingly, is that the editor, Shmuel Yatzkan, would ask the wives of the wealthy owners of the newspaper, so that's the Finkelstein family, he would ask the wives what Russian novel or what Russian translation of a French novel they were reading at the time, right? What these sort of upper class women were reading. He would obtain a copy of this novel and then throw it to his stable of writers. The writer's task was to adapt the novel, so not exactly translate it. In this case, the case of Die blutige Frau was mapping the saga of sort of a French aristocracy onto the wealthy Jewish elite of Warsaw. This means a healthy dose of Judaization. Think of that Warsaw thief, and suddenly, he's invented out of whole cloth, and including his very specific kind of Warsaw language. At the same time, it would be clear to writer and reader alike that the plot is explicitly modeled on a foreign original. In fact, it was part of the appeal of Schund that it could both import something from a language some readers wouldn't have full access to, while also marking it some way as Jewish along the way. Translation here enables cultural transfer while also marking the new text as explicitly different from its original. Now, this is not an entirely smooth process, of course. The opposite, there is some pleasure, I would say a kind of guilty pleasure, in showing precisely where this trash doesn't measure up, where the seams of translation give way. And I'll use one example here, is that one of the characters is heroically trying to solve the murder mystery. And in a moment of exasperation, he says to himself, "Medarf dazu haben a Sherlock Holmes, was soll sich kennen in dem Plonter voneinander nehmen." We need a Sherlock Holmes to sort out this mess. The casual reference to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's character does more than just point out to the novel's depth to the conventions of detective fiction. Indeed, it somewhat points to a glaring gap, since if Sherlock Holmes had indeed come into the novel, it would be over within the next couple of issues. Whereas this Shunderman has to last at least another 7 or 8 months in order for Heint to make money off of it. But more than that, the author admits in this moment to being deeply influenced by the literary archetype, which had been translated and adapted the world over, including into Yiddish. But he also knows, and he's showing at this moment, that the Yiddish Shun novel cannot be the perfect articulation of detective fiction. Sherlock Holmes will not be walking into the novel in its next installments. It remains, right, according to the phrase, verteidigt und verbessert. In this way, always falling short of an imported norm while still moving forward with its daily momentum, of course. This wink to the reader is meant to be some kind of comfort, but one not lingered on for very long, for the writer and audience already know the terms of the game. So if we're coming back to Taytsh, right? Taytsh, the incomplete and dynamic status of translation, is the novel's surface rather than its dramatic wound. There's no attempt here to make something overtly Jewish. In fact, it performs its translationality to its readers. More on this later. And now a third and final example to start off. Let's turn to our present moment for a bit and go to the collective effort to translate the phrase Black Lives Matter into Yiddish, an act both practical and symbolic. As most of you know well, lots of problems abound in this translation, right? The literal translation would use the word schwarze for black, which in an American context, though not only in an American context, would immediately have pejorative and even racist connotations, and would be particularly explosive today, given the tensions between Hasidic and African-American communities. The choice to translate to Afro-Amerikaner leads some Yiddishists to cry foul, protesting such foreign or seemingly inauthentic words. The option of transliteration, Black Lives Matter, combined with some kind of parenthetical translation, idiomatic or otherwise, exposes perhaps productively the instability of such a project, reflecting and thinking about the various racial and cultural tensions that surround translation in its American context. And then on top of all this, there's the question of who such a phrase might be for. What does it mean, for instance, to produce this slogan in Hebrew characters on a placard in public protest in New York? Does it invite people of color into a Yiddish-speaking space? Or is its main objective to mark a kind of, or perform a kind of Jewishness in the public sphere that would be in contrast to some other kind of Jewish discourse? Right? So who is Black Lives Matter in Yiddish for exactly? A Taytsh reading of this moment, which is employed to profound effect by Anthony Russell, one of the authors of this list, in his reflections on the project, which you can look it up in Jewish Currents. It's a great essay. He explains that these tensions cannot nor should be resolved, that there can be no proper Jewish or Yiddish ownership of Black Lives Matter. As Anthony puts it, quote, to some degree, the imperfection is the point, end quote. So translating the phrase into Yiddish is not going to fit into neatly into some idealized history of Black Jewish relations. Rather, this moment of Taytsh produces, perhaps in its best case scenario, a living vocabulary that would expose past and present injustices while imagining new ways of speaking. Taytsh presents the opportunity for continued discourse around an unsolved or unsolvable thing, rather than by saying Black Lives Matter can be wholly sort of assimilated into Yiddish. This would be, in my mind, some sort of capitulation to a kind of Jewish nationalist discourse, a Jewish nationalist narrative. Okay, so those are the three moments I was thinking of. And what I'd like to do is call for a shift in our reading practices around Yiddish that sort of follow some of the modes of reading that I was already testing out here. A shift in our reading practices for Yiddish and for modern Jewish culture more broadly. And the idea is, rather than see Yiddish as a homecoming, right, an arrival within a circumscribed and knowable Jewish space, I want to notice Taytsh, those imperfect moments of repeated and incomplete cultural contact. And this is where I think we need a manifesto. And now, before I get to the 10 bullet points, as all manifestos should have, I want to emphasize again the change in vocabulary that I'm proposing. This is a Taytsh manifesto. It's not a Yiddish manifesto, right? Taytsh, as you all well know, is one of the earliest names for this language, a term that means something like German, though not exactly, and not always. Taytsh is very close to Deutsch, and it is this proximity without identity. So it's not exactly the same thing, though it is very, very close to it, that is so important, I think, for our thinking today. It's no wonder that the word then would come to have a very different kind of meaning in translate and explicate. So phrases like Taytsh, was ist der Taytsh? And this is in contrast to something like Yiddish, a name of the language which only became widespread, of course, in the 20th century with the rise of Jewish nationalist movements around the same time. So if I'm being bombastic, which is what a manifesto is supposed to be, right? Yiddish is only 100 years old, whereas Taytsh is probably 1,000 years old. Or to go further, because why not? One could say that Taytsh, in its productive and precarious uncertainty, is ageless in a way that Yiddish is not. One more note before I get to the point, the big 10 points. I want to emphasize that this manifesto is not meant to be some kind of Oedipal struggle. I'm not coming to this manifesto on my own. I'm indebted to scholars like Naomi Seidman, Anita Norwich, Hannah Grodenfeld, who's here, Gerald Frakes, even someone like Adriana Jacobs, who writes mostly about Hebrew, but for which translation becomes a basis for thinking about Hebrew, and many other scholars who have made this call to and for translation before me. And what I want to do here is to catalyze some of these conclusions and push them further. And to just use a terrible pun, right? My aim is to make manifest that which has been going on all the time, right? Taytsh has been with us all along. Okay, on to the manifesto. Here are 10 statements about Taytsh as a paradigm for rethinking Yiddish cultural production and Jewish modernity. I've included with each point an image, more or less randomly chosen from the Yiddish press to illustrate each point. So I'm hoping that this will be entertaining for those who disagree or already worked up in some way, or have been zoomed out already after only a couple minutes, that you'll enjoy at least these ads to sort of distract you. And they're really fascinating moments of cultural indecision, which you can find just simply, going to JPress and going through any of the pages of any of the Yiddish newspaper. You immediately encounter these moments of amazing Taytshness, as it were. Okay, onto the list. Number one, Taytsh as a marker of cultural entanglement is the structural logic of Yiddish. So the first thing I want to say is that we need to shift our understanding of language history. Taytsh is the structural logic of Yiddish in that it describes a process of cultural entanglement. Right? So Dukus Horant is not a Yiddish document. Rather, it's a text constructed in the midst of shifting cultures. A text only becomes Yiddish, only becomes Jewish, in any definitive way, through the implementation of a normative and often nationalist frame. And we'll come back to the nationalist frame later on in our bullet list. 2, Taytsh is a Jewish language. Taytsh is a non-Jewish language. So by refusing to call Dukus Horant Jewish in and of itself, I don't mean to say that there's nothing Jewish about the text. The opposite, right? one has to notice those things that are named and mark themselves as Jewish, as we demonstrated with Tifle. There is a constant movement between identifications that we can identify within this cultural logic. As a result, the Jewishness of a text, as Taytsh say, is not some essential, guarded, or hidden secret. It's reductionist to think of Yiddish being a text's heartbeat or something like that. And I think on top of that, we need to stop biologizing Yiddish as part of the construction of some kind of Jewish national body, imagining periods of infancy, adolescence, and then final pure maturity as a modern secular language of the Jewish people, right? So instead, Taytsh allows us instead to resurface a recurring impossibility, that boundary where Jewishness is marked, but also falls away, though never to disappear. So it's no wonder, and people have heard me talk about this before, that Yiddish is often described as undead or perpetually undergoing some kind of renaissance. Taytsh refuses the normative life, the telos of a normative life that we might associate with nationalist mythologizations, in favor of a kind of multiplicity that you already see in one of these ads, in which you have lots of languages happening all at once. On to number 3. Oh, 3. Taytsh is a language of migration. It's both noodles, right? Whatever we think noodles are for Lukchen, whatever all the different cultures that go into Lukchen as a Jewishy food, but also American pie, right? Apple pie, as American as apple pie. Taytsh is a language of migration. So in defying or failing to comply with models of European nationalism, Taytsh often has trouble with territorial boundaries. So though we know more or less where the language comes from, and we cannot avoid the fact that Eastern Europe cradles the language in so many ways, and that even so, that Yiddish or Taytsh can become embedded in landscapes across the Ashkenazi diaspora and even beyond it, still Taytsh always arrives elsewhere. Taytsh is diasporic not just in its supposed affiliation with a migrant population, but because the language itself performs local affiliation and global disjunction simultaneously, that those two things happen at the same time. And this leads me to the sense that Taytsh is a language of cultural indecision. So the kind of multiplicity and immobility that we're talking about here in a sort of diasporic language or migratory language leads to, I think, a logic of cultural indecision, a failure or refusal to cultural legibility. We could think of the Shundraman we talked about before, that cannot be named as detective fiction, but has to be named as detective fiction at the same time. Or even this ad for a translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. What does it mean for Yiddish to own Uncle Tom's Cabin? This is also the second translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think, or the third. I have to ask Eli Rosenblatt about that. But what does the process of Judaization do in each of these cases? What kind of ownership or partial ownership does Taytsh allow, and toward what end? A Taytsh paradigm allows us to answer these questions paradoxically by deferring them. To speak and write in Taytsh and to render a text into Taytsh means to speak multiple languages at once and to never settle on one or the other. Taytsh is the language, to use a kind of Rosenzweig kind of language, a language of improper hospitality. More Derridian than Rosenzweigian, but that's okay. Okay, number 5. Beware the normative practice of the hyphen. The X-lax joke here is mostly just for fun. If you're ever going through the Vorwärts, X-lax was an advertiser for the Vorwärts throughout much of its run, and I have an ad blocker, so I can't see now, but maybe if we go online today, still the Vorwärts is doing X-lax advertisements, but it does have a hyphen in it, so that's why I used it. And there's hyphens everywhere on this page, but anyway, beware the normative practice of the hyphen. What do I mean by this? It's indeed tempting to simply name a text as Jewish, to settle the Dukusoran dispute, to bury the Shundraman into the annals of some kind of Jewish popular culture, and to leave it there. The act of naming a language or a practice as Jewish or Judeo erases the complexity of the moment of cultural contact. And a hyphen, as in something like Yiddish Taytsh, or Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, or even Jewish-American, right? This kind of hyphenation obscures and silences the cacophony that otherwise rises from the never fully commensurate yet overlapping communities that surround this Jewish, the modern Jewish-speaking subject. So in other words, it's easy to call something Jewish and, in which the Jewish side of things is simply assumed as legible and coherent, and you can sort of leave it be. And sort of you end up having between the hyphen, on either side of the hyphen, two stable entities that you can define and not worry about the tensions between them, or imagine in some ways that the hyphen provides some kind of synthesis between them. But one of the things I'm arguing for in kind of being aware of this normative practice of the hyphen is that we need a naming practice that would confront how multiple Jewish and non-Jewish discourses irreducibly intertwine, and sometimes violently so. So that if we're imagining an entanglement between two cultures, we're not imagining some kind of harmony. The opposite, entanglement, often involves a kind of an instability that has dire consequences for Jewish populations or for anyone involved in it, right? So rather than imagining them at some kind of safe distance from one another, American on one side, Jewish on the other, we want to see them somehow in their cultural dynamism. And this brings me to an aligned point: beware the national frame. So the hyphen ultimately follows a logic of national difference. I'm sure many of us have had this experience where someone finds out that you study or speak Yiddish, or you're involved in the Yiddishist world in some way, and they spew at you various assumptions they have about Yiddish. Essentializations of one way or another, nostalgia, Yiddish is not really, it's a kind of bastardized German, or whatever they throw at you, and your impulses. And I remember learning this very early in my Yiddishist life, to say, no, Yiddish is a language just like any other. Yiddish has a literature, Yiddish has a history. I've used this line before. But I think what that answer does is impose, I'm sure many of us still use it, right? It imposes the same national frame. Yiddish is a language just like any other, is already announcing your complicity within a kind of nationalist narrative in which you can name the Jewishness, or the Jewishness that you're constructing about this language is assumed to be normal or regular in some way. Whereas what I think we need to do is actually emphasize difference, or think about difference as a constitutive part of the language. Translation is that practice in which one identifies and lingers with difference. So in other words, and this is something I mentioned at the outset, it's not about seeing translation as the measure of influence between discrete cultural bodies, or how well something has been Judaized, or how high a given writer achieves in the ranks of world literature. What I think such approaches do is limit our reading of Jewishness to this kind of very limited European or Eurocentrist mode, in which some kind of discernible Jewish population remains the assumed baseline for some concatenation of a single, even if pluralistic, concept of Jewish identity. So in place of it, I love this ad. Translation is the condition of modern Jewish culture. So Morgenjournal, of course, is an Orthodox Yiddish newspaper, and that there are these two Aryan boys here on this page advertising for Pesach clothes and for matzahs is just like wild to me. What these Aryan boys are doing, I don't know. But translation is the condition of Jewish culture. So not Jewish identity as the condition of modern Jewish culture, but translation as the condition of modern Jewish culture, as conditioned by translation. Translation is a mode of cultural dependency and intimate conflict. It names a site of entanglement, as I've said, in which it's unclear who might be speaking. So in which vernacular, this is a mouthful, but I like it, in which vernacular inscrutability mingles with the possibility and failure of universal communication. So you have this moment, we all know this, in which a word is untranslatable. It's so deeply Yiddish, say, that's a word we use. It's so embedded in a language context that it cannot be translated. And that moment happens simultaneously, even in the same word, with the possibility and failure of some kind of universalization of that same concept. That those things happen simultaneously, right? That we have these boys who have become the most American on Broadway, that also need new clothes for Pesach, and they need to eat matzahs in a couple of weeks or whatever. I don't know when exactly Pesach was in 1921. That's what I mean by it being a condition of it. And one of the things that comes out of this, and I'm about, this is some heresy here, hopefully it will be well taken. Translation does not imply synthesis. Taytsh is not a fusion language. So fusion language is one of the biggest theses and accomplishments of the Weinreich school, if you want to put it that way. And one of the things I'm arguing is that Taytsh as a concept does not imagine the possibility of synthesis or systematic alignment of component parts. Taytsh cannot fully assimilate Black Lives Matter, or I must have said it before, Black Lives Matter. Like, why did I feel so uncomfortable in that moment of transliteration that I had to somehow take on a fake Hollywood Russian accent in order to say that transliterated phrase into Yiddish? So there's something about it that some things don't come together in a certain way. Or think of a concept often associated with the way we praise the genius of Yiddish modernism. This is from an article from Janet Hada, Komponentwissigkeit. That Yiddish has this capacity, supposedly, to mobilize the various components of Yiddish, whether it be the Slavic component, the Hebraic component, toward particular kinds of artistic achievement. Or that this is a particular flexibility of Yiddish. But I want to say that instead of flexibility, it allows us to come to an awareness of Wissigkeit about how the instability and porosity of the language, right? So in that sense, Yiddish or Taytsh takes place between cultural spheres, produces a translational conduit that is neither entirely constitutive of Jewish self-determination, nor entirely aligned with some non-Jewish sovereignty. So there is a kind of a refusal to fusion that takes place in Taytsh. And in that way, 9, Taytsh calls us to the critical practice of uncertainty. The sudden appearance of tifle, the surface hybridity of shund, the rigorous indecision of Black Lives Matter, or even, I think this holds true for the canon of Yiddish literature per se. So I'm thinking of something like Shalom Aleicham's monologues, that we think of them as some kind of ethnographic achievement. They're often referred to as Shalom Aleicham's ability to come to the voice of the folk, to represent the voice of the folk, whereas a Taytsh reading of these texts would allow us to see that Shalom Aleichem is offering here a meditation on the recurring failure of Jewish vernacular speech. Or think of Anna Margolin and Tzile Dropkin's poetry, and how un-Yiddish their Yiddish poetry is. There's something translational or uncertain about their adherence, almost against their will, to some kind of Jewish literary tradition. Or I'm also thinking, I think this is going to come up later in the conference, about the idea of Yiddish science, Yiddish Wissenschaft, or the whole YIVO model, in which there's some kind of anxiety around the sudden realization that the object of study isn't as Jewish as they want it to be. This allows us to, the Taytsh allows us to encounter this uncertainty in more productive ways. Or even something like revising in some way the idea of the post-vernacular Yiddish. That post-vernacular is not just an encounter, a symbolic encounter with an invented Jewish past, but also a confrontation with the fragmentation that Taytsh and translation demand. Or even just thinking about all these ads. What exactly are they selling and to whom? So this is ready for like a back to the future logic of this thing. If one buys these products, and the products mostly make you want, their aim is Americanization or Polonization. One buys those products and suddenly becomes the American and Pole that one is supposed to be, then one retroactively cannot understand the ads anymore. The condition of buying these and consuming these products is to lose one's language in some way. Does one begin to lose Yiddish the moment one consumes Taytsh? Is there that kind of those who've seen Back to the Future know sort of what I'm talking about, a kind of self-erasure implied in it, or what would it mean to defer or act differently than assuming this kind of self-erasure? Self-erasure depends on a kind of seeing Yiddish as identity. If it's not Jewish, If or it's only partially Jewish, then you're already falling apart. Taytsh encourages us to think about this uncertainty in a different way. And that brings me to number 10. And so my answer to this question of one's anxiety about identity is that Taytsh demands an ethics of comparison. And that translationality provides this opportunity or responsibility towards it. And I love this juxtaposition. This I totally found randomly. So you have Zwei Kuni Lemels on the side, right? Goldfaden's one of Goldfaden's most famous plays. And then in the middle, you have an advertisement for China dishware. So think of all the Orientalism that goes into thinking about the association with China and this particular kind of dishware and the Lower East Side and everything that implies, but also, I guess, Boston, Mass is the case for these ads. This must have been from the Boston edition that was scanned into JPress. And then on this third side, we have Helmar Turkish cigarettes. Now, I went down a very deep internet hole, and I'll explain some of my research about this brand, but it is insane. Originally, the name of the cigarettes was Ramle, so Helmar backwards, Ramle, but there was a competing cigarette company called Ramli with a Y at the end. So they cleverly turned it around and made it Helmar. Now, Helmar, of course, is a very German name, but these are Turkish cigarettes. But at the same time, Ramla, by the way, is a town, a village in Palestine at the time. So it has a kind of Middle Eastern feel to it. So even though it's German Palestine-ish, for whatever reason, they decided that the iconography would be Egyptian. So that's a pharaoh on the front. On top of all this, the owners of the company were Greek. So I'm not exactly sure how they came to this. And of course, the text here is Yiddish. So most often we think about this grouping. Especially those of you have used JPress before, you know you can highlight certain things. And when you highlight an article, the rest kind of goes dark a little bit. So our impulse as Yiddishists is to click on Zwei Kuni Lemels and be done. You know, the rest is sort of, we're blind to it. And those who have scrolled through the Yiddish press, you know you stop seeing the ads. You're just going through. But one of the things I want to ask is, what happens if we take this proximity very seriously? How can we read Zwei Kuni Lemels as participating in some way in the colonialism, imperialism, and Orientalism that these other ads produce? What does it mean to think about these consumer objects as part of the same commercial culture that propels and motivates popular Yiddish theater? Right? What does it mean to think about these things together? And what I think a Taytsh paradigm offers us is the ability to attend to these questions and thereby produce new conversations across linguistic and scholarly boundaries. Taytsh invents new forms of comparative thinking by moving beyond Ashkenaz, outside the walls of Yiddish, outside an exclusive Jewish space. Through Taytsh, we think more explicitly and in dialogue with other migratory languages, say, if I'm being ethnocentric in some way, right, in and through other Taytschen that might surround Yiddish in its various ways. So, and one of the arguments I think I'm making here by using the word ethics is it's not just an opportunity, but rather in the Derridian sense, a responsibility. Taytsh produces an incomplete relation, and as such demands constant re-articulation within and against Jewish and non-Jewish conceptual frameworks. We can't let these three ads just be, we have to think about them together. Okay, those are the 10 points. And I'll end with a motto of sorts. Taytsh is not entirely one's own. It begins and ends elsewhere. That it is now and perhaps has always been a dying and undead language, a forgotten language that still everyone knows. It's these paradoxical ways of thinking about the language only heighten its translationality. Taytsh is the untranslatable vernacular of translation. Thank you, and I look forward to comments, questions, objections, anything that comes up.
Thank you so much, Saul. That was very inspiring. I enjoyed it immensely. I agree with everything you said. I think that I live
That's a little bit surprising.
By your manifest. Actually, can you return to the first point? And then we'll also, because this is the only one I couldn't write down. and couldn't understand. And I'd like also to allow others to.
Okay. So I'll keep sharing my screen is what you want.
Yeah. Because we might want to refer to them and first, as a mark of cultural entanglement, is the structural logic of Yiddish. Okay, okay, I understand now. Okay, so
I tried to make the point somewhat repetitive, as any good manifesto should also.
No, I think it's great. I think it's also a great way to open the conference. I'm sure that all the subsequent lectures will fall in all the traps that you have marked. So we'll have a lot of what to talk about. Ruth Kohn. So, yeah.
Yes. Hi, good morning. I don't know whether I understood it correctly, but it seems to me that the Taytsh that you're talking about falls in place with, for example, the Hasidic vernacular that they're speaking now, which I used to get very angry and upset that about 1/3 of it was English. Mm-hmm. So apparently they're just adapting to this pattern. And am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, so that's one of the motivations for thinking about this, is that we as Yiddishists, or I shouldn't say we, as an editor of Ingeveb, we were often accused at times at the beginning that we didn't focus enough on what's really going on in Yiddish today, right? That we didn't focus on Hasidic Yiddish and think about it. And one of the motivations for me in thinking about Taytsh was that how can we think about Yiddish beyond this particular narrative of Yiddish modernization that we've all been trained into in a scholarly way, that for good reason our teachers really focused on, especially in a post-war, post-Holocaust mode. They wanted us to imagine a canon of Yiddish, a normalization of Yiddish as a way to preserve it, that there's a kind of heroism that I at least remember my teachers, especially David Rusky, there's a kind of heroism to that kind of work. But one of the things that I think that we miss along the way is to understand that dynamism both in the past, right, that Yiddish modernism isn't as clear and clean as it is presented to us, but that also in the present, it allows us to not just dismiss Hasidic Yiddish as some kind of bastardization of the real Yiddish, that it is as present and as possible and as participates in some of the same language logic, say cultural logic that appears throughout the history of Yiddish, though in different ways, right? It's obviously informed by a very different set of conditions and different sets of translational opportunities.
And I would even say that from a Hasidic point of view, it even seems like you're discovering the wheel. This is like a day-to-day, maybe that's an idealization, but I think that this is, Nomi, question. Do you want me to read the questions? Should I read the question? If it's written in the chat?
I can read it out loud. How might gender lens alter and enrich questions of Taytsh? In items 5 and 9, seem like areas where gender is applied in a particularly Taytsh manner. Let's go to 5 and 9. So 5 is the normative practice of the hyphen, and 9 calls us the critical practice of uncertainty. So yes, gender is an important lens here. So the Schundroman, the improper genre of Yiddish literature is, of course, modeled off of a kind of female readership, supposedly. That's the ideal reader is a woman, or a lot of the ways we might think about a normalization of Yiddish often infers a masculinist hierarchy, a kind of mastering, a masculine masterization of culture. And that often, if we think in terms of querying a lot of those modes or offering different kind of gender lenses on those particular texts, you arrive, of course, at a destabilization in some way of those same projects of normalization. So I talked about Shalom Aleichem, the fact that these meditations on the impossibility of Jewish vernacular take place in the mouths of women for the most part, though not entirely, speaks to some of that same kind of anxiety that he is trying to deal with through a kind of instrumentalization, of course, of a woman's voice and a woman's body. So I definitely agree that there is something uncertain or one one leans towards or thinks about the queering of Yiddish in and through Taytsh, though not always, right? It depends how you think about it and in what directions you go. So I don't want to, label this as also a queer theory of Yiddish, because I think those things can happen simultaneously, though not entirely overlapping. I mean, manifestos have this tendency to be able to name everything as Taytsh, and I want to do that because there's a kind of hubris to it, but I think they're aligned in that way.
Okay, thanks. So Isabel and then Arnaud. First, Isabel, please.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you what you think the importance is of the written word and specifically of the Hebrew character, and that also kind of in relation to the vernacular or the spoken word.
In some ways, this is kind of like a reader response kind of question, right? Since it is Hebrew characters, and so presumably only those who know and can read Hebrew characters can consume this text. And so we limit it in some way, almost from the beginning, to what we assume to be a Jewish audience can consume these texts. But I want to imagine that we can think about text beyond this kind of consumer model, say. What does it mean for a Jewish reader to read this text and then enter the world, right? We often think about the forwards, right, has a dual, think of this, the forwards having a dual model in terms of its readership. One is to Americanize its readers, and on the other hand, to prepare them to enter an entirely Jewish space and want them to stay in that Jewish space. Because if you Americanize your readers too much, they won't read the forwards anymore, right? So similarly, what exactly does the Hebrew character do? It limits, but also it limits your audience to a particular space, particular set of texts, while also, even at the same time, inviting them to consume other texts that they only can gain access to through the Hebrew characters. So I'm thinking of, if you think about Dukus Orant, what does that text, we don't know, because we just don't know much about that time, but if I'm thinking about Gerald Frake's book, what does that announce about the communities that consume this text? Does it mean that they want to import, or that they've imported because they want to export? Or access other cultures outside of a Jewish language speaking space. So that's the way I think about Hebrew characters, as both, again, serving this dual purpose of announcing the Jewish and allowing access to the non-Jewish at the same time. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Now, Arnaud, please.
Yeah, thank you, Del. Thank you very much. So it was very fascinating. It was all the more fascinating that it is pretty much contrary to some of the interest I have about canonicity. One of the focus of the project I'm conducting has to do with canonicity, the idea of canonical text and everything. And I'm very interested in the way you take the things the other way around, since actually Taytsh was pretty much the enemy of modern Yiddish culture. Taytsh was the enemy of Mendele when he tried to translate some prayers because they destroyed the taste of the modern Yiddish reader. So I think it's a very, very interesting way of considering Yiddish today, and I think it's I would like to use it as well for the past. I think it's still important to remain by some national ambitions, which have been so important in fashioning the modern Yiddish culture. But I will definitely like to take more into account those undercurrents that you've put into light. And I will finish with one question. Since your definition of Taytsh was very, let's say, postmodernist in the sense that it is very open to the uncertainty, to the absence of boundaries and everything. which kind of, let's say, scales of values does the Taytsh Manifesto leave from, let's say, from the old canonical visions of Yiddish culture, from the good, great writers and everything? Do you think we should still hierarchize the writers, or should we read Schund like we read the, let's say, Mendele? What is your position on this?
Those are great. That's a great question. So to sort of respond to your first part of your comment at the same time as I try to think about that second question, is I always go back to thinking about Shalom Aleichem and Shomer. Shomer, the famous supposed Schund writer, though Schund, the word Schund hadn't been invented until the late 19th century. So Shalom Aleichem didn't even use that word in his screeds against Shomer. But I would say if you read Shomer's Mishpit, Shalom Aleicham's great screed against Shomer, it has almost nothing to do with Shomer. Shomer barely appears, his work barely appears it's a very long screed. And it appears that Shalom Aleichem hadn't read that much and didn't want to read it very closely either. But if we think about the 19th century, who is the most famous Yiddish writer? It has to be Shomer. Shomer is the most important 19th century. I mean, maybe there are others too, but in terms of reaching an audience, especially in the 19th century, Shalom Aleichem barely had an audience, Mendele even less. They only achieved this canonical status, as you can read from my colleague Sonny Yudkov's book. Shalom Aleichem only becomes famous because he gets sick. Otherwise, who knows if he would even become famous. There's great campaigns to raise money for him so he could afford to go to the sanatorium that he went to. And that whole process made him famous. And with him, through this vein, he brought the other classic kid with him in some way. Peretz perhaps is a little bit different. But yeah, there's a kind of entanglement between these two. And what I want to argue is that it's a kind of libidinal entanglement. So take, for instance, Shalom Aleicham's first novels in the late 19th century, where he's trying to write a novel and he fails repeatedly because he can't, as Naomi Simon has shown us, can't get the love story right, or has a lot of trouble with the love story. This wasn't a problem for Shomer. If he had to adapt a French novel, he would do it, no problem, and just throw things around. Also, he was also a very conservative writer. So he had very clear morals and even Jewish maskilic morals that he wanted to import through these acts of translation or adaptation or whatever kind of storytelling you want to call it. So what I want to say is they're actually more closely aligned than you might assume. So Shalom Aleichem, he wants to instead create this kind of basis of the folk, and out of the folk comes the literature. This is imported. This is imported as much as Shomer's as novels and models for novels is imported. It's a Western concept that he learns in some ways from Russian or from other ways, and that he wants to reproduce. And creating a canon is a Western European model for cultural production. So these same things that he's doing are also Taytsh. They just don't get named as such because they are the process of Taytsh is obscured in some way. So that's my argument, which again makes Taytsh happen before everything else. But that's what I would sort of argue as a kind of frame of normalization or frame of reading the normalization project that Shalom Aleichem and Mendele to a certain extent is involved in.
Thank you.
Okay, I see there are no more questions, so I'll just say my comment. I think the only thing that bothers me a bit is the idea of a manifest, because a manifest fixes in time, like something that is so historical. And it's so clear that these 10 points work because so much knowledge is invested on each of them. And I'm thinking about these conversations you were talking about with people who don't know so much about Yiddish and see through the national screen of Yiddishists and engage with Yiddishists in a way that prompt the Yiddishists to say, no, it is a true language. It is not corrupt German, etc. I feel that to reach what you have reached, to reach those 10 points, this manifesto that can work in this context of this conference, these hearers, this public, I'm not sure if it can become a manifest, an operational manifest. This also connects to what Arnaud says, what kind of text should be taught, for example, for people who start to learn Yiddish. I think that this is the only thing that, in a way, before reaching this manifest, you need, or you have to understand the manifest. You need to go through quite a lot of, let's say, myths, canonical myths, in order just to get it. That's my
yeah, I'm not sure. Like, what would our graduate educations look like, or even our Yiddish 101 courses look like if we touched on it? But it's very easy to read. It's very easy to read, so it's actually very teachable, and it's not as Taytsh as people think it is. It's usually it's a very clean, especially in the Yiddish press, a very clean Yiddish. That's one thing, and the other thing I could just, because we haven't mentioned Kafka yet, and we're already an hour into the conference, so the one of the things that I think is powerful about the public-facing nature of a Taytsh paradigm is that you can immediately throw it at the other person. You speak Taytsh too, right? Everybody speaks Taytsh. It's you know that your language. It's not as if your German is pure, or your French is pure, or that even especially English. English is not a fusion language. English is a language that's falling apart all the time, especially in America, say. And that this is sort of an important, like it's a model that it doesn't just, it's not only Yiddish. What I'm saying is Yiddish wears it a little bit more publicly than other languages, but that I think it enables a certain kind of dialogue that otherwise gets shut down. If you say, oh, you speak Yiddish, that's your language, that's a language of Bubbies and Zadis, or that's, you know, that's the language of the Hasidic world, there's immediately a kind of frozen, the language, the conversation is already over, as opposed to, hey, we're all going through this language instability together in different ways. So I think one of the at least optimistic and say utopian ways of thinking about the Taytsh paradigm in the public sphere.
Thank you so much, Saul. It is our time for the break. So we're going to meet here exactly in 14 minutes for the first session. So enjoy your break and see you very soon.
Thank you.